A man stood in a ring of fire. Blood soaked his shirt, a living shield between the hungry flames and a small wooden cabin. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, sharp and final. The fire roared, reaching with orange fingers for the dry timber of the cabin. But the mountain of a man wouldn't move. He wouldn't yield. Inside that cabin, a woman and a child huddled on the floor, praying to a god that seemed very far away. The man's eyes didn't show fear. They reflected the flames, but what burned inside him was hotter. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything once, and he would not survive losing it again. But to understand how he got there, we have to go back. 3 months earlier, Montana Territory, autumn of 1877. The fog in the morning hung low over the ridges, like ghosts sleeping on the bones of the earth. Out on the prairie, a lone rider moved slow. The kind of slow that says you're not going anywhere important, or maybe you just don't care if you ever get there. The man's name was Mason Thorne, and he was a giant. His shoulders were as wide as an axe handle is long, his coat caked with the mud of 1,000 miles. His hat was pulled low, hiding eyes that had seen too much war, too much death, too much everything. The folks down in Thistle Ridge, the nearest town, they didn't know much about him. They called him the Mountain Man. They knew he lived alone in a cabin that leaned a little, as if it was as tired of standing as he was. They didn't know his real name, and they sure as hell didn't know his story. But Mason had a story. Back in his cabin, under his cot, was a small tin box. Inside were the only pieces of his old life. A photograph of a woman with a kind smile and a little girl just learning to walk. A tarnished Union officer's badge, and a folded piece of paper. On that paper were 5 names written in a careful hand. The names of the men who had burned his family alive. He had sworn an oath to hunt them down, to put every last one of them in the ground. That was the plan. Until he found the letter his wife had left for him. Her last wish. A plea from beyond the grave. Don't choose vengeance, she'd written. Choose life. So he came west. He built a cabin with his bare hands and tried to forget. He tried to bury the rage. Most days, it almost worked. He was riding through a place called Whispering Pass when he heard it. A sound that cut right through the morning silence. It was thin and trembling and human. It was the sound of a child singing. Mason pulled his horse up so hard it snorted. He swung his leg over, his boots hitting the damp earth with a thud. The singing came again, faint, like an echo from another world. His eyes, usually clouded with memory, sharpened. He scanned the terrain. Over by a cluster of rocks, he saw it. Trampled brush, and just beyond, a circle of stones around a dark hole in the ground. A dry well. He walked over, his steps silent. He knelt at the rim and peered into the darkness. And that's when he saw her. A little girl, no older than his own daughter would have been. She was maybe 15 feet down, clinging to the jagged rock wall. Her dress was torn, her knees were scraped raw, but she was singing. A soft, wavering little song that rose out of the dark like a prayer. She looked up and saw the massive shape of the man blotting out the sky. The singing stopped. Her eyes went wide. She didn't know if he was a savior or something else entirely. Mason didn't say a word. He just reached into his saddlebag, pulled out his rope, and expertly tied a loop. He tossed it down. "Hold on," he muttered, his voice gravelly from disuse. The girl's hands were trembling, but she grabbed the rope. Mason braced his boots against a tree stump and started to pull, slow and steady, like he was pulling up a bucket of something too precious to spill. Halfway up, her small hands slipped. A little scream tore from her throat. Mason grunted, his jaw clenched, and he tightened his grip. The muscles in his forearms burned. He held on. He would not let her fall. Inch by inch, he hauled her out of the darkness until he could reach down and grab her under the arms. She felt like she weighed nothing at all. He set her gently on the grass. For a long moment, nobody moved. The little girl was covered in mud and filth. She coughed, wiped her mouth, and then looked up at the giant who had saved her. His face was a landscape of shadows under the brim of his hat. A scar on his left cheek seemed to twist when he breathed. He just stood there, his big, calloused hands hanging at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But she stared right at him, as if she could see straight through the silence, right into the broken places inside him. "Mama says brave is being scared, but doing it anyway," she said, her voice small but clear. "But you're still doing things, even though you're scared inside." Mason Thorne blinked. It had been years since a child had spoken to him, let alone a child who seemed to see him so clearly. It was unnerving. He took a step back, feeling more uncomfortable than if he'd been facing down a firing squad. "What's your name?" he asked, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Grace," she said. "Grace Porter." "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, even though her knees were bleeding. "I was picking flowers for Mama," she explained. "The ground just opened up." "You were singing," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Singing keeps the dark away," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Mama taught me. When you're scared, you sing, and the scared gets smaller." Before he could process that, a woman's voice cried out from over the ridge. It was frantic, breathless. "Grace! Grace! Where are you?" "Here, Mama!" Grace shouted, her voice suddenly strong. "The big man saved me!" A woman came running over the rise, her skirts hitched up, her hair coming undone. She skidded to a stop when she saw Mason looming over her daughter, and in a single, fluid motion, her hand dropped to her waist, her fingers curled around the grip of a small revolver tucked into the folds of her dress. Her name was Emma Porter. She was 28, but her eyes held the kind of weariness you see in people twice her age. Her face was etched with lines that didn't come from smiling. Her icy blue eyes scanned every shadow, every movement. They were the eyes of someone who trusted no one. The only time they softened was when they landed on her daughter. Relief flooded her face for a single second, and then her gaze snapped back to Mason, hard as steel. "He pulled me from the well, Mama," Grace said, pointing. "I fell, but I sang like you taught me, and he heard me." Some of the tension left Emma's body, but her hand never strayed from her gun. "Thank you," she said, her voice a near whisper, "for saving my daughter." Mason just dipped his chin. He was a man who knew the value of silence. He stepped back, giving them room, and turned for his horse. "Wait!" Grace called out. "Don't you want to know my mama's name?" Mason paused. He looked back at the woman who was still watching him, her eyes full of suspicion. "It's Emma," Grace said. "Emma Porter. She was a nurse in the war. She fixed people." A flicker of something crossed Mason's face. Recognition. He'd seen nurses like her. Women with nerves of steel, working in the middle of chaos and death. "Wasn't looking for thanks," he finally said. "Just passing through." Emma studied him a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. She took Grace's hand to lead her away, but the girl broke free. She ran back to Mason, and before he could react, she threw her tiny arms around his massive leg, a quick, fierce hug. "Thank you for hearing me," she whispered. Then she ran back to her mother. Mason watched them walk away, the woman with her rigid back and watchful eyes, the little girl skipping beside her, already humming a new tune. And deep inside Mason Thorne's chest, something cracked, a fault line spreading through the stone he'd built around his heart. He mounted his horse and rode toward his empty cabin. But the sound of the child's song followed him, an echo that just wouldn't fade. The town of Thistleridge was little more than a handful of weathered buildings leaning against the wind. For Emma Porter, it was far enough. She and Grace had arrived 3 weeks before, running on the last of their savings. They'd told the locals they were a war widow and her daughter, looking for a fresh start. It was easier than telling the truth. It was easier than saying the name Nathaniel Hayes. It was easier than explaining the bruises that had finally faded from her wrists. That night, Emma brushed Grace's hair. "Mama," Grace asked, "do you know the big man?" "No, sweetheart, why?" "His eyes were sad," Grace said. "Like yours are, sometimes." Emma's hand paused. "Some people carry a lot of sadness," she said softly. "It doesn't mean they're bad people." Grace nodded solemnly. "He needs someone to make him soup. You always say soup fixes the inside hurts. His inside hurts are big, Mama. I could tell." Emma had to smile. "Grace Porter, you have the strangest way of seeing people." "I just look with my heart," the girl said. After Grace was asleep, Emma sat by the window. The revolver was on the table beside her. She pulled a small, leather-bound journal from her bag. It was her husband Thomas's diary from the war. She'd read it 100 times, but tonight she turned to the last entries, the pages before he died at Spotsylvania. May 5th, 1864. Hayes acting strange again. Disappeared from camp last night. Came back smelling of smoke. The men don't trust him. May 8th. Rumors of a Yankee artillery captain whose wife and child are living nearby. Some of the men are talking ugly. This war turns good men into monsters. May 10th. Hayes and another man, Johnston, are missing from camp tonight. I fear... The entry just stopped there. The next page was torn out. 2 days later, Thomas was dead. Shot in the lung. Emma closed the book. The questions haunted her. After Thomas died, his cousin, Nathaniel Hayes, had offered her protection. She'd been lost in grief and accepted. But his kindness soon twisted into control. His jealousy grew with every breath Grace took. The night she fled, he had burned her husband's letters, sneering, "He's gone, Emma. I'm the only family you have now." But he'd missed the journal, the last piece of Thomas she had left. Emma tucked it away. She had to find work. The money was almost gone. She checked the locks on the door, then slid the revolver under her pillow. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with shadows. Mason woke before the sun, a habit from the war that never left him. He made coffee and stepped onto his porch. The sky was turning from indigo to gold. From his high perch on the ridge, he could see the whole valley. He could see the small cluster of buildings that was Thistle Ridge. And on the edge of town, he could see a thin curl of smoke rising from one small chimney. The Porter cabin. He thought of the woman with the haunted eyes and the little girl with the trusting song. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. They weren't his problem. His only problem was getting through another day, another winter. He drank his coffee in the heavy silence of his cabin. But today, the silence felt different. It felt emptier. He found himself listening for a sound that wasn't there, for a child's song rising from the dark. He saddled his horse. He told himself he needed supplies from town, flour, ammunition. It was just a coincidence that the trail to town led right past the Porter cabin. As he got closer, he saw Emma outside, hanging laundry. Her shoulders were tense. She was constantly scanning the woods around her. She looked like a soldier on watch. He noticed the roof of her cabin. It was in bad shape. Shingles were missing. The first heavy snow would come right through. He meant to just ride by, but Emma looked up and saw him. She froze. Her hand dropped to her apron pocket, where he knew she kept that little revolver. He gave a small nod. She nodded back, just as reserved. "Roof's bad," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Won't hold in the snow." "I'll speak to the owner," she replied, though they both knew that was useless. "Grace all right?" he asked, surprising himself. A little of the hardness left her face. "Yes, thank you again." He should have ridden on then. There was no reason to stay. But he didn't move. Then, from inside the cabin, the singing started again. Grace's clear voice. "Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you." The song hit Mason like a physical blow. A memory, sharp and brutal. His own daughter, Hannah, singing that same song. His wife, Rebecca, smiling, joining in. The warmth of his kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the life that had been stolen from him. He must have flinched, because Emma took a step forward. "Mister? I don't believe I know your name." "Thorne," he managed to say. "Mason Thorne." Mr. Thorne, are you all right? He straightened in the saddle. Fine. Just remembered something. The singing continued, innocent and heartbreaking. Away! I'm bound away, cross the wide Missouri. Your daughter has a fine voice, he said, the words thick in his throat. She's always singing, Emma said, her eyes studying him now with a new kind of interest. Says it keeps the fears away. That song? It means something to you. Mason's jaw tightened. He'd said too much. He'd stayed too long. Good day, Mrs. Porter, he said, tipping his hat. He turned his horse and rode toward town, but he could feel her eyes on his back, and the melody of that old, sad song followed him all the way, a ghost he could never outrun. That night, it rained. Emma sat by the fire, mending one of Grace's dresses. Her thoughts kept returning to the mountain man, to the raw, unguarded pain on his face when he heard that song. There was a story there, a tragedy. She pulled out Thomas's journal again. She traced the words, thinking of her husband's quiet strength. He'd fought for the Confederacy not out of hate, but out of loyalty to his Virginia home. A gust of wind rattled the window, and she glanced up at the dark water stain on the ceiling. Mr. Thorne was right. The roof wouldn't last the winter. Before the sun was up the next morning, Mason was back. He didn't have supplies. He had tools. Quietly, efficiently, he climbed onto the roof of the Porter cabin and began replacing the broken shingles. He worked fast, hoping to be gone before anyone woke up. He packed up his tools just as the sky was beginning to lighten. He was about to mount his horse when the cabin door opened. Emma stood there, a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the roof, then at him, surprise and something else in her eyes. Mr. Thorne, she said, Did you fix our roof? He shifted, uncomfortable. Needed fixing, winter's coming. I can't pay you, she said softly. Didn't ask for payment. Her brow furrowed. The suspicion was still there, warring with gratitude. Why would you do this? Mason looked away, toward the rising sun. Girl shouldn't be cold in winter. The silence stretched between them. Thank you, she finally said. He gave a sharp nod, swung onto his horse, and was gone. Back in his own cabin, he found something on his porch. A small, folded handkerchief. A child's awkward embroidery of music notes stitched around the edge. He stared at it for a long time. Then he carefully placed it in the tin box under his bed, right next to the picture of his wife and child. A new routine began. Every morning before dawn, Mason would leave something on their porch. A sack of flour, a string of dried apples, a perfectly split bundle of kindling. He never knocked. He never waited. He was a ghost, leaving gifts in the dark. At first Emma was wary, but work was hard to find, and Grace needed to eat. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then, on the fifth morning, she was waiting for him. She sat on the porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, and another one waiting beside her. Mason reined in his horse, caught. Good morning, Mr. Thorne, she said, a hint of humor in her voice. I believe it's customary to accept a cup of coffee after fixing a lady's roof and providing for her table. He hesitated for a long moment. Then he dismounted. He took the offered cup, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second. They sat in silence, watching the day be born. It was a comfortable quiet. Grace asked about you yesterday, Emma said. She wanted to know if angels can be giants. Mason nearly choked on his coffee. I'm no angel, ma'am. I told her as much, Emma said, a small smile playing on her lips. Though I admitted I wasn't entirely sure what you are, Mr. Thorne. Just a man, he said, staring into his cup. A man who fixes roofs and leaves food for strangers. You were a soldier, she stated. It wasn't a question. He nodded. My husband was too, she said quietly. Thomas Porter. He died at Spotsylvania. Mason went very still. Confederate. Yes, she said, watching him. And you? Union. 4th Artillery. The air thickened. The ghosts of the war stood between them. Does that change things? He asked, his voice low. Me helping you? Emma thought for a moment. Thomas always said the real division wasn't north and south. It was between those who fought from hate and those who fought from love. Which were you, Mr. Thorne? Mason looked her straight in the eye. War makes everything murky, Mrs. Porter. From inside, they heard Grace start to stir. Emma stood up. Thank you for the coffee, Mason said, rising as well. And thank you for everything else, Emma replied. He turned to leave, but then he paused. Your daughter's song, he said, his voice rough. Shenandoah, my daughter, she used to sing it. The words hung in the air, a raw confession. Used to? Emma asked gently. Mason's jaw tightened. She's gone now. Her and her mother. Understanding and a deep, shared sorrow dawned in Emma's eyes. I'm sorry. He didn't reply. He just swung himself onto his horse and rode away. But this time it felt different. For the first time in years, the silence of his cabin on the ridge didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like an emptiness. In the weeks that followed, the morning coffee became a ritual. They didn't talk much, but in the quiet moments, pieces of their stories began to surface. Emma learned Mason had been a captain, a man his soldiers called the Wall, because he never broke. She learned he used to play the guitar. Mason learned Emma was the daughter of a doctor, a skilled healer in her own right who had seen the worst of the war from inside a field hospital. They never spoke of their deepest wounds, the fire, the abuse. But they didn't have to. They could feel the shape of the other's pain. Grace started leaving gifts for Mason, a wildflower, a crayon drawing of his horse, and sometimes Mason would leave a small carved wooden animal for her. One evening, Emma saw him on the ridge, a dark silhouette on horseback, just watching their cabin. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent acknowledgement. Two lonely souls, seeing each other across a vast emptiness. Something was shifting. A door, long bolted shut, was starting to creak open. One night, the full moon cast a silver glow across the cabin floor. Emma woke up with a start, her heart hammering. She heard a noise on the porch, a soft creak. She grabbed the revolver from under her pillow and slipped to the window. It was Mason. He was placing a bundle by her door, moving like a shadow. What was he doing here in the middle of the night? She opened the door just as he was turning to leave. He froze, caught. Mr. Thorne, she whispered. Is something wrong? He looked uncomfortable. Saw tracks today. Human. Someone's been circling your property. Emma's blood ran cold. Who? Don't know, but I thought you should have this. He nodded at the bundle. She knelt and unwrapped it. It was a Winchester rifle, well-oiled and loaded. You know how to use one? He asked. She nodded. It's Thomas's cousin, she said, her voice tight. Nathaniel Hayes. That's who I'm running from. Mason's face was grim in the moonlight. He hurt you. It wasn't a question. Yes, she whispered. And the girl? Not with his hands, but with his eyes, the way he looked at her, like he owned her. Mason's own hands clenched into fists. If he comes here, he said, his voice low and deadly, you shoot first, ask questions later. She looked at this quiet giant who brought food and fixed roofs and now brought weapons in the night. Would you like some coffee, Mr. Thorne? She asked. He hesitated, then nodded. Inside, he stood awkwardly in the small room, looking too big for the world she lived in. Please sit, she said. They drank coffee in the low lamplight. Why did you really come tonight? She asked. He stared into his cup. Couldn't sleep. Too quiet up there. He gestured toward his cabin on the ridge. Used to like the quiet. Now. I know, she said softly. After Thomas died, the silence was the worst part. Does it ever get easier? The missing? He looked at her then, and she saw the same hollow ache that lived in her own chest. No, he said. But you get stronger at carrying it. The raw honesty of it took her breath away. Thank you, she whispered, for the rifle and for the truth. He stood to leave, At the door, he turned. "If he comes," Mason said, "fire 3 shots. I'll hear you." "Even all the way up on the ridge?" "I'll hear you," he repeated, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would. The next morning, Grace found the rifle. "Is it for the bad people, Mama?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart." "Is that why Mr. Thorne protects us?" Emma was stunned. "You know he visits?" Grace nodded. "I see him in the dark. He fixes the broken parts of our house. He's like the giants in the stories, Mama. Scary on the outside, but good on the inside." Grace wasn't afraid of him, not at all. "His eyes are sad, but they're kind," she said. "And he liked my song." Emma knelt down. "Mr. Thorne lost his family, Grace. His wife and his little girl. That's why he's so sad." Grace's eyes went wide. "Like we lost Papa?" "Yes, like that." The little girl was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a question that hit Emma like a thunderbolt. "Can we be his family now?" "It's not that simple, honey." "Why not?" Grace insisted. "He needs a family, and we need a papa." "Grace Porter," Emma said, flustered. That's not how it works." "But you like him," Grace said with unshakable confidence. "I can tell." Before Emma could argue, Grace pulled a small object from her pocket. It was a tiny wooden horse, carved with exquisite detail. "He gave it to me," she whispered. "A secret present." Emma took the small horse. The craftsmanship was incredible. To think that Mason's huge, calloused hands could create something so delicate, a new piece of the puzzle of who this man was slotted into place. "Grace," Emma said gently, I think sad people should stick together so they don't have to be sad alone." A tear pricked Emma's eye. Her daughter, who had never known a father, had more wisdom in her little finger than most grown men. "So, can we ask him to supper?" Grace pleaded. "I want to sing for him again." Emma looked out the window toward the silent cabin on the ridge. For the first time since she'd run from Nathaniel Hayes, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It wasn't quite hope. Not yet. But it was the suggestion that hope might one day be possible. And for now, that was enough. The annual Harvest Festival turned Thistle Ridge into a sea of lantern light and laughter. Emma was hesitant to go, but Grace deserved a night of fun. They were standing near a cider press when a hush fell over the crowd. People stepped back, clearing a path. And there, on the edge of the celebration, stood Mason Thorne. He held his hat in his hands, looking as out of place as a bear in a church. He'd actually come. Grace had invited him that morning, and he'd actually come. Grace spotted him and ran through the crowd, throwing her arms around his leg. "Mr. Thorne, you came." Mason's grim face softened, but just as Emma reached them, a new tension rippled through the festival. 3 riders were entering the town square, trail-worn, armed, and moving with a purpose that made the music falter. The man in the lead dismounted. He was handsome, well-dressed, and he smiled a charming smile that didn't reach his eyes. Emma froze. The blood drained from her face. It was Nathaniel Hayes. "Emma!" Nathaniel called, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as a razor. "Thank God I found you. The family has been worried sick." Emma pushed Grace behind her, her hand finding the revolver in her pocket. "What are you doing here, Nathaniel?" "Looking for you, of course," he said, his eyes flicking from her to Mason, then back again. "You've been through so much. It's understandable you'd be confused. But running away isn't the answer. Thomas would want his daughter raised by his own kin." "Thomas would want his daughter safe," Emma shot back. The townspeople were watching, silent and wary. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. "Mrs. Porter, is everything all right?" "Just a family matter, sir," Nathaniel said, turning on the charm. "My cousin's widow has been unwell, prone to fits of fancy." He was painting her as a hysterical woman, an old, cruel trick. But then Grace did something unexpected. She didn't cower. She ran straight back to Mason. "Mr. Thorne!" she cried, clinging to his leg. "He's the bad man." Every eye in the square turned to the mountain man, and on Mason's face was a look of cold, deadly calm. Nathaniel's smile faltered. "Who's this?" Before he could get an answer, an old woman named Martha Sullivan, who ran the boarding house, stepped forward. "This gathering is for the people of Thistleridge," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "And we don't appreciate men who frighten our children. Mrs. Porter and her daughter are under the protection of this community now." One by one, other townspeople moved to stand with her. The minister, the blacksmith. They formed a quiet, solid wall around Emma and Grace. Nathaniel was smart enough to know when he was outmatched. For now. "Of course," he said, his smile back in place. "We've had a long ride. Tomorrow will be better." He tipped his hat to Emma. "We have much to discuss, cousin, about family obligations." Then he and his men followed Martha toward the boarding house. As soon as they were gone, Emma let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Thank you," she whispered to Mason. He just nodded, his face grim. "You need to leave town," he said. "Tonight." "Where would we go? He'll just follow us." "My cabin," Mason said. "Up on the ridge. He won't find you there." Emma looked at the faces of the townspeople who had stood up for her. Then she looked at her daughter, who still refused to let go of Mason's leg. The child's instincts had been right all along. It was time to trust them. "All right," she said. "We'll go with you." An hour later, they were riding through the moonlit forest, Mason leading the way through a wilderness he knew like the back of his hand. Grace fell asleep in Emma's arms. When they finally reached his cabin, it was a fortress of solitude nestled among the pines. He carried the sleeping child inside, placing her gently on the bed in a small back room. "This was your daughter's room," Emma said softly, seeing a small carved bird on the windowsill. Mason nodded, his face unreadable. "Hannah's. She would have wanted it used, especially by a child who needed to be safe." He turned to leave, but Emma stopped him. "Mason," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you." In the flickering firelight, his eyes were dark pools of shadow. "Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow will come soon enough." Emma lay down beside Grace. She should have been terrified. Alone in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew, with a killer hunting for them. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. As if, after years of running, she had finally found solid ground. Emma woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Grace's quiet laughter. She walked into the main room, and the scene stopped her in her tracks. Mason was at the table, the big guitar across his lap. He was carefully guiding Grace's small fingers over the strings. "That's it," he was saying. "Press down firm." Grace strummed, and a single clear note rang out. Her face lit up. "I did it, Mama! I played a real note!" Mason looked up and saw Emma, a flicker of something like embarrassment on his face. "Good morning," Emma said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "I see music lessons have begun." "Mr. Thorne says I have natural talent," Grace announced proudly. Emma watched them, the giant of a man and the tiny girl, a fragile, beautiful picture of peace. But she knew it couldn't last. "Have you seen any sign of them?" she asked Mason in a low voice once Grace was distracted. He shook his head. "Not yet, but they'll come." "What will he do?" "Try to take you back," Mason said, his face hardening. "Claim his rights. He won't succeed." "I found something," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "In Thomas's journal. Something you need to see." She opened the worn book to the last entry, the one about Nathaniel and Johnston disappearing from camp, the one that mentioned the rumors of a Yankee artillery captain's family living nearby. Mason took the journal. He read the lines, and his expression grew dark as a thunderhead. "You think Hayes was involved," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In burning my family's home?" "I don't know for sure," Emma whispered. "But the timing, the location. Thomas died the day after he wrote this, Mason." He handed the journal back, his movements stiff. "If he was," Mason said, his voice low and hard, "then this isn't just about you and Grace anymore." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Nathaniel Hayes might not just be Emma's tormentor. He might be one of the 5 names on Mason's list, the man who had destroyed his world. Mason, Emma said, her heart aching for him. Revenge won't bring them back. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a grief so raw it was like an open wound. I know that, he said. This isn't about revenge. It's about stopping him from destroying another family. In that moment, Emma understood. This was no longer just about offering shelter. Mason had drawn a line in the dirt. He had claimed them as his own to protect. Just then, Grace cried out from the window, "Mama, Mr. Thorne, come quick! There are men on horses!" Mason was at the window in an instant. His body went rigid. "It's them!" he said, his voice calm, but the soldier in him had taken over. 3 riders, Hayes and his men. He strode to the fireplace and took down his rifle. "How long?" Emma asked, already pulling Grace into her arms. 10 minutes, maybe less. Get her to the cellar, now!" Emma knelt in front of her daughter. "Grace, you have to hide. No matter what you hear, you do not come out until I or Mr. Thorne come for you. Do you understand?" The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. "I can sing," she whispered, "to keep the dark away." Mason opened the hidden trapdoor in the floor. "That's right, little one," he said softly. "Sing, and remember we're right above you." Emma helped her daughter down the ladder. Then Mason sealed the trapdoor. He handed Emma her husband's revolver. "Stay inside," he commanded, "away from the windows." "Where will you be?" "Outside," he said. "Better to meet them in the open." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Emma," he said, his voice rough, "if I don't get the chance to say it later, having you and Grace here, it's made this place feel like a home again." Before she could answer, he was gone. Emma ran to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Below, Nathaniel Hayes and his 2 hired guns emerged from the trees. From under the floorboards, she could hear the faint, trembling sound of Grace's singing. Emma gripped the revolver, her knuckles white. She watched as Mason Thorne stood alone on his porch, a solitary wall against the coming storm. The final battle was about to begin. "Morning, Hayes," Mason said, his voice deceptively calm. His rifle was held at a casual rest, but his eyes missed nothing. Nathaniel swung off his horse, his companions fanning out on either side. They were hired guns. Mason could see it in their cold, empty eyes. "Thorne," Nathaniel said with a tight smile, "I'm here for my family. Step aside." "They're not your family," Mason replied, "and they're not going anywhere." Nathaniel's smile vanished. "What happens in my household is my business. Emma, get out here now." Emma's voice cut through the air as she stepped onto the porch to stand beside Mason, her own revolver held steady. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Nathaniel. Not now, not ever." Nathaniel stared at her, then at Mason. His eyes narrowed. "I know you. You were a Union man, an artillery captain." A slow, dawning horror and recognition spread across his face. May, 1864, Northern Virginia. "A Union officer's house burned to the ground," Mason said, his voice like stones grinding together. "Ring any bells, Hayes?" Nathaniel's face went pale. He tried to bluff. "You're crazy. The war was full of tragedies." "This wasn't war," Mason snarled. "This was murder." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're lying!" Emma cried. "Thomas knew. He wrote it in his journal. He was going to report you for your atrocities. That's why you killed him, isn't it? It wasn't a Yankee bullet at Spotsylvania. It was yours." Nathaniel's composure finally shattered. The charming mask fell away, revealing the monster beneath. "He was weak!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "A coward! With his precious conscience! He was going to ruin everything! And yes," he spat, his eyes blazing with hatred as he looked at Mason, "we taught that Yankee captain a lesson! Burned his house to the ground! He practically invited it, having his family so close to the front." He was confessing to everything. The murder of his own cousin, the murder of Mason's wife and child. In that moment, Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. All the years of pain, of rage, of emptiness, all focused on this one single point. One shot, and it would be over. Justice. Vengeance. But then he heard his wife's voice in his head. Choose life. He looked at Emma, standing bravely beside him. He thought of Grace, singing in the darkness below. He had found life again. He would not sacrifice it for vengeance. "It's over, Hayes," Mason said, his voice steady. "Throw down your weapon." For an answer, Nathaniel gave a nod to his men. The world exploded in gunfire. "Emma, inside!" Mason yelled, shoving her toward the door as he fired. The first hired gun went down, clutching his shoulder. The second fired back, splinters flying from the porch post next to Mason's head. Nathaniel dove behind a woodpile, firing wildly. Emma, using the cabin doorway for cover, returned fire. Bullets ripped through the morning air. Under the floor, Grace had stopped singing. She was huddled in a ball, her hands over her ears, trembling in the dark. It came down to a standoff. Mason pinned behind a rain barrel, Nathaniel behind the woodpile. "It's over!" Mason yelled. "Your men are down!" "It's not over until I get what's mine!" Nathaniel screamed back. But then Mason saw it. The second hired gun, wounded but not out, was creeping around the side of the cabin, trying to get a clear shot at Emma. "Emma, down!" Mason shouted, turning his rifle to fire at the new threat. It was the opening Nathaniel had been waiting for. He burst from cover, his own rifle raised, aimed directly at Mason's exposed back. Emma saw it all happen in a frozen, terrible instant. Mason turning to save her. Nathaniel taking aim. The man who had protected them, who had brought music back into their lives, was about to die. She didn't think. She acted. She stepped clear of the doorway, raised her husband's revolver with both hands, took a steadying breath, and fired. The shot was deafening. Nathaniel staggered, a look of pure shock on his face. His rifle went off, the bullet plowing harmlessly into the dirt. He dropped to his knees and then fell sideways. Silence. Emma stood there, the gun still pointed, smoke curling from the barrel. Mason took out the second gunman with a shot to the leg, then ran to her side. "Emma," he said softly. "It's over." "He was going to shoot you," she whispered, her voice hollow. "In the back. I couldn't let him take anyone else from me." He gently took the gun from her trembling hands. "You did what you had to do," he said. "You protected your family." Just then, a spark from one of the rifle shots caught on a dry patch of pine needles. A small flame flickered, then grew, licking up the side of a dead tree. "Fire!" Mason yelled. "We have to get Grace and get out of here!" They pulled a terrified Grace from the root cellar just as the fire began to roar, consuming the dry forest with terrifying speed. They scrambled onto the horses and rode hard, the heat of the blaze on their backs. They were racing for a creek, their only hope of escape, when a figure stepped out of the trees blocking their path. It was the first hired gun, the one Mason had shot in the shoulder. He had a pistol in his good hand, and it was aimed right at Mason. "That's far enough," the man snarled. "Hayes is dead, but his money's still good. I'll be taking the woman and the girl." The fire raged behind them. A gunman stood before them. There was no escape. Mason's rifle was empty. He was about to charge the man, a desperate, suicidal move, when another shot rang out. Not from the gunman. The hired gun jerked, his pistol flying from his hand. He spun around to see old Martha Sullivan standing at the edge of the woods, a smoking shotgun in her hands. Behind her were Dr. Mitchell, the Reverend, and half a dozen other men from Thistleridge, all armed. "When I said they were under this community's protection," Martha said, her voice ringing with authority, "I meant it." The townsmen took the wounded gunman into custody. Together, they all scrambled across the creek and into a shallow cave system just as the fire swept over the ridge, consuming everything. Mason's cabin, the place that had been his refuge for 3 years, burned to the ground. From the safety of the cave, they watched the forest burn. Grace was asleep in Emma's arms. Mason came and sat beside her. "I'm sorry about your cabin," Emma said softly. "Everything you built." He shook his head. "It was just wood and nails. Can be rebuilt." "Will you?" she asked. "Rebuild?" He was quiet for a long time. "Not there," he finally said. "Too many ghosts now." He turned and looked at her, his eyes reflecting the distant flames. "I'm asking," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed, "if I can build something new. For all of us. Somewhere without so many shadows." Grace stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Is our home gone?" she asked sleepily. Mason nodded. "Yes, little one." The girl thought about this. "That's okay," she said. "We can build a new one, with a bigger porch for music." She looked between the two adults. "We're still a family, right? Even without a house?" Emma's eyes met Mason's. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "We're still a family." Mason's large hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers. "Family," he agreed, and the word was a promise. 6 months later, a new cabin stood in a sheltered valley, miles from the burned-out ridge of Thistle Ridge. It was larger than the old one, with a wide porch and a garden for Emma's herbs. The winter had been a time of healing and hard work. They had built a home, and in the process, they had built a life. One spring afternoon, the little community gathered on a hillside overlooking the new cabin. Mason stood tall, his eyes clear and full of a quiet joy. Grace, with a crown of wildflowers in her hair, stood beside him. And Emma, radiant in a simple blue dress, walked toward them. They were married by the Reverend from Thistleridge under a wide-open Montana sky. "I thought I was a ghost," Mason said in his vows, his deep voice carrying on the breeze. "But you and Grace, you taught me how to breathe again." "And you taught us the meaning of home," Emma replied, her eyes shining. "It's not a place. It's the people who stand beside you." That night after the celebration, after Grace was asleep, they stood on their new porch. The stars were scattered like diamond dust across the sky. "Happy?" Mason asked. "Yes," Emma whispered. "Not because we've forgotten the past, but because we've learned our hearts are big enough to hold both memory and new love." He kissed her then, a kiss that was full of promise and gratitude. From inside, they could hear Grace singing softly in her sleep. A new song, one she'd made up herself. "Found our way home, crossed the wide Missouri." They had been through the fire, literally and figuratively. They had faced down monsters and ghosts, and they had come out the other side, not just as survivors, but as a family forged in loss, bound by courage, and healed by the simple power of a song. They had found their way home, not to a place on a map, but to each other. If you enjoyed this story of how 3 broken souls found their way back to the light, be sure to hit that like button. And for more stories about the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, don't forget to subscribe.